While my specialized Tarmac SL8 is the best bike I've ever ridden, and on paper, it's probably the bike that most consumers would choose over my giant Propel, unfortunately, that does not mean that the SL8 is my favorite bike of all time. That award actually goes to my giant Propel. Now, of course, my considerations for the Propel over the SL8 are strictly subjective. That conversation really requires a separate comparison video. So in today's video, we're going to talk about my experience of riding my Giant Propel Advanced Pro now that I've owned it for 1 year. And in this video, we're going to, of course, be talking about some of the negatives and quirks of owning the Propel, the positives and some of the riding dynamics of the Propel as well. And then, of course, I'm going to be talking about whether or not you should choose to purchase the Giant Propel in 2024. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The frame, the carbon stem, and the carbon saddle cost me about $4,000 altogether USD. And for myself as a rider, I train and I ride about 10,000 miles a year or about 12 hours a week. And while I've done crit races in the past, these days I just stick to my local fast group rides and the occasional road race. I'm by no means a bike racer, but I am a recreational enthusiast who loves to get stronger every year, which I have, and I'm always down for racing on Zwift in the wintertime because I'd rather risk getting dropped by a cheater on Zwift than risking my collarbone in a crit race just for a bag of coffee. So first off, let's talk about some of the negatives and quirks of the Giant Propel Advanced Pro. The first one we're going to talk about is tire clearance. There's actually 4 negatives. So the first one is tire clearance. Now, I believe on Giant's website, the max tire clearance is about 30 millimeters or 30C tires. I've ran wheels on this Propel where the tires were 30C, a Continental GP5000 tubeless that do plump up to about 32 millimeters at the tire. That's probably the absolute limit. These days for modern road bikes, they usually can fit anywhere between 32, maybe even 33 or 34 millimeters. So if that tire clearance is important to you, that definitely is going to be a negative with the Giant Propel. The second negative with this bike is crosswind stability, or crosswind instability, I should say. As far as all the modern aero bikes that I have reviewed on this channel, unfortunately, the Propel is probably the worst. And this issue is exacerbated depending on your choice of wheels. Now, some of my favorite wheels that I've ever used on this channel are for sure my Craft Racing Work, the 50/60 variant. Because those wheels are so light and that front wheel is basically like a boat sail, they're just not stable at all. And then the problem gets added due to the fact that the Giant Propel, because the way the front end is set up and designed, just with that elongated head tube, the bike is not that great in crosswind. So if you live somewhere with a lot of hilly terrain and it's very windy, you will have to make special considerations to your wheel choice because the stability is not there, especially if you're running something like an Elite Drive 65D wheels. For sure, they are going to be pretty unstable. The third quirk or negative with the Propel is the ride firmness. Now later, you're going to see that firmness is also going to be positive. It's strictly subjective, but the ride is very firm. It's controlled, but it is pretty stiff. Making sure that you have the proper wheel choice and tire pressure consideration becomes very important because the Propel is just very sensitive to how stiff the wheels are and that tire pressure. So if you are someone that does not like to feel all of the feedback from the road, this probably isn't going to be the bike for you. I love the way that feels, but for most people, it's probably too stiff of a ride and you're going to have to run, I would say, at least 30 or 32C tires just to sort of edge off that firmness. Or of course, you can just run a set of Aero wheels that are using steel spokes. And the fourth negative is Giant's ecosystem of components. Just like the TCR, the Propel also uses a steer tube that Giant calls their OD2 or Overdrive 2 system. And what that essentially means is the diameter of the steer tube is wider than your average steer tube. I don't know what the measurements are, but essentially the steer tube is wider than your traditional steer tube. So essentially you are locked into using only Giant's selection of cockpits and stem. There are third-party brands out there from like EXS or FarSports that do offer up integrated cockpits that allow you to run this thicker steer tube. But really, if you want to change out the stem, you are stuck in Giant's ecosystem. This is the same problem with Scott line of bikes as well, because they use only a 1-inch diameter for the steer tubes. You are essentially locked in for good with only using Scott's own proprietary cockpits. Moving right along, let's talk about some of the positives and the riding dynamics of my Giant Propel Advanced Pro now that I've ridden it for a year. My best single day ever of riding was on my Giant Propel. It actually happened earlier this year in the summertime. I was riding with the group up in Madison, Wisconsin, and the ride was 100 miles long, but it was over 6,000 feet of elevation. Now, if you live somewhere with a lot of hills and climbs, that may not be impressive to you as far as elevation goes, but for where I live in Chicago, where it's pancake flat, it was incredible. It was by far the most difficult single day of riding ever, and the Propel just felt so right at home. If you spend any time riding up in Wisconsin or in the driftless region of Illinois, you know that there is a lot of climbing to be had. There aren't really a lot of sustained climbs, but in 100 miles, you are essentially going up and down for like 5 hours long. So essentially every 10-15 minutes, there was a climb, some sort of punchy climb to take on. And that is exactly where this bike shines. On anything that has a lot of punchy rolling terrains, of course on the flats, this bike is fantastic for that reason. I just love the way that this frame dances going up punchy climbs, and then when you're descending, especially paired with some quality wheels and tires, just the way this bike descends and handles, it just really feels so locked in. I cannot stress that enough. And that is one of the reasons why I prefer the Propel over the SL8. I just love the riding dynamics. I really love the riding feel of the Propel over that SL8. Earlier, I mentioned that some of the negatives with the Propel is the fact of the ride is very firm and it's very stiff. I myself personally, I like that feeling. There's a reason why I've purchased 2 Specialized LA Sprints and why I can't seem to get rid of my Windspace T1500 frame set is because yes, those rides are very stiff and can be a little bit too stiff for the average rider. I prefer that feeling because I just love the feeling of having that feedback underneath my tires. I always know what my wheels are doing at all time. And when the pace gets fast in a group ride where you're sprinting upwards of 40 miles an hour, or if you're descending down some climbs like I did in Madison where you're hitting speeds beyond 45 miles an hour, you want to know what your wheels are doing at all times. And the Giant Propel just does all of that so well. I love that feeling. I like to say it reminds me of the difference between, say, like a Porsche Turbo, like a 911 Turbo versus a Porsche 911 GT2. Both of those bikes are fast in their own respects. One is going to be more comfortable for everyday use on the streets, while the other one is more geared towards track use. And that's what the Propel reminds me of. If you're riding it every single day, it may not be great for the average rider who's not used to that firmness, but for myself, I love it because it always wants to come alive. It always wants you to constantly go. And that's just something I've just gotten accustomed to with all of the other frames that have been stiff in the years past. So that's kind of a gobbledygook of positives to this bike, but it's a fast bike. It's very firm. It offers a lot of feedback, and just the way the geometry is set up, I'm just so locked in. And there's just like this symbiotic relationship between the frame and the rider myself. I love the way this bike feels. And lastly, guys, should you consider the Giant Propel in 2024? Well, that just depends. What's important to you? What do you prioritize? If you appreciate the amazing riding dynamics and feedback that the Giant Propel offers, if you enjoy a ride that is very darted in its handling, and if you have a higher pain threshold when it comes to stiffness and firmness, I know that sounds crazy, then for me, the Giant Propel ticks all those boxes. I really appreciate a ride that offers up a lot of feedback because I just love to know what my wheels and tires are doing at all times. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's a reason why I always end up going back to a Specialized LA Sprint and my Windspace T1500, because yes, those rides are firmer compared to something like a SL8, but in turn, you get a ride that offers a lot of feedback. You always feel connected to the road, you feel planted, and there's just this amazing connection that you have between the rider and the frame, something that I just don't really get with the SL8 every time I hop on that bike. It's kind of like the difference between one frame is a joy to ride and the other is exciting to ride. The SL8 is a joy to ride all day. I've done rides on that for like 6-hour long rides. I've also done the same thing with the Giant Propel. The Giant Propel is always exciting to hop on. Maybe you don't want to have that sort of excitement every time you ride on the bike, because that will come with, like I said, that added firmness and stiffness. But if you are someone like me that does not mind having that experience every time you ride on the bike, where you know that, look, this extra stiffness means that you're going to be ready to pound on the pedals immediately, then the Giant Propel for sure is a frame set that you should be considering in 2024. So I'm going to leave the video at that, guys. Thank you for sticking with me this long. Questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them down below. And I'm going to check you guys on the next one. And stay tuned, as I'll probably do a deeper dive comparison on the SL8 and the Giant Propel. Thanks for watching, guys. See you on the next one. Peace.